Rias, Bose, Juice, Dominic, all the distinguished gentlemen in the audience, Rajiv Chandran of the UN, friends, it really is a pleasure to be here with these fellow sailors on the sea of imagination in this event. I had wanted to come for the opening on 12/12/12. Couldn't get away, Parliament was in session. So this is about a month late, but I'm delighted to have had a chance to walk around and see samples of the exhibits that you have in one of the 13 sites that you've got lined up. The name of the event, Kochi-Muziris Biennale, is itself a leap of imagination across centuries of history and culture. The present-day vibrancy of Kochi, linked with the legendary glories of the ancient port of Muziris, both centers of commerce, of a cosmopolitan worldview that is not merely based on the exchange of goods and services, but above all else, I would argue, of ideas. Now, globalization today has become a pejorative term in many parts of the world, and I dare say to many of the artists whose politics are on display as well as their art in this exhibition. The triumphalism and hope that the idea of globalization evoked in the wake of the collapse of communism have given way in the aftermath of 9/11 and the global recession to a sense of fear and distrust of this idea. The rich parts of our world fear the loss of their preeminence in this globalized world, while the developing countries feel the dawn of another age of economic and cultural domination. One could be forgiven for thinking that fear and insecurity are the most widely traded currencies in the global marketplace today. This, of course, in my view, is a very narrow understanding of globalization. It accords primacy to trade and economics above everything else, and ignores the long and distinguished history of globalization in other areas of human endeavor, most prominently in the field of the arts and of the human imagination. Consider the possibility that as humanity emerged and evolved into its present recognizable form, the central facts of the human condition, birth, life, and death, became the common canvas for everyone's imagination. This was true across communities and cultures, even as they grew sometimes in complete physical isolation from one another. Whether it is the Iliad or the Odyssey, or the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, whether it's the creation myths of the Bible or the Holy Quran, or those narrated in the legends of the Vikings and the Egyptians, we see at least as much in common as we see what is different and unique. The common strands that run through the earliest stirrings of the human imagination are not without significance. Since the dawn of civilization, globalization as a universal response to the fundamental challenges of human existence has been with us. The ancient mind understood it well, and therefore travel, exile, loss, and belonging have been common themes engaging our imagination since the dawn of recorded human history. The world of trade and commerce are new to the process of globalization. Human imagination got there first. Seen this way, globalization has been an essential part of the human condition. What has changed in our lifetimes is the speed and the scale at which it spreads around the world, creating opportunities and shockwaves in equal measure. In thinking about my topic for today, I thought about the issues that have dominated my nearly 3 decades at the United Nations. I thought about the forces of globalization irresistibly transforming the world, and the information technology revolution that brings to our breakfast tables and to our living room television screens, and increasingly, of course, to our computers and our mobile phones, snippets of information and glimpses of events from every corner of the globe. These are the forces of convergence that have made the world one village, one market, one audience. And yet I also thought about the changes that the terrorist attacks of 9/11 in New York and what we call 26/11 in Mumbai, and the response to them, have wrought in us and in our imaginations. The rise in violent manifestations of intolerance, and of course the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and elsewhere. These are the forces of disruption that threaten to create new divisions between haves and have-nots, between North and South, or perhaps between the West and the rest, between different forms of Islam, and between people of different creeds and cultures and religions. These two groups of phenomena are clearly pulling us together even as they drive us apart. And so I wonder, has the change that has become a central facet of our lives, as chips get faster and the internet gets broader, done something more than allow us to ask ourselves Microsoft's question, where do I want to go today? Has it also forced another question onto our global imaginations, one with more fearful overtones that we might call a macro-hard question, not a micro-soft one? Who else is coming? Has globalization, which has brought McDonald's and Microsoft and Mickey Mouse and Game Boys to every home, also thrust Osama and Obama, Saddam Hussein and Bashar al-Assad into every mind? Has the human imagination become globalized mainly in terms of fear? The creative and artistic impulse must fight this colonization of the global consciousness by fear. Events such as this Biennale are an important effort in our fight against this attempt. At the risk of being facetious, our major stories reek of globalization. Take, for instance, the tragic stories a few years ago about the 10th anniversary of the death of Princess Diana. Now, what's that got to do with globalization, you may well ask? Well, look at it this way. An English princess with a Welsh title leaves a French hotel with her Egyptian companion, who has supplanted a Pakistani. She is driven in a German car with a Dutch engine by a Belgian chauffeur full of Scottish whiskey. They are chased by Italian paparazzi on Japanese motorcycles into a Swiss-built tunnel where they crash. A rescue is attempted by an American doctor using Brazilian medicines, and the story is now being told to you in Kochi by an Indian member of parliament from Thiruvananthapuram. There's globalization. But indeed, any doubt I might have had about the reach and influence of global mass communications was dispelled when I happened to be in St. Petersburg, Russia, for a conference, and was approached by a Tibetan Buddhist monk in his robes, thumping a cymbal and chanting his mantras, who paused in his chanting to say, "I've seen you on BBC." New communications technology has shrunk the world and, in a real sense, made it all one. But on September 21, 2000, we seem to have some official visitors who will probably engage some of the, oh my gosh, who do we have here? Welcome, welcome. I saw a state vehicle driving up, and there is the Director General of the Indian Council of Cultural Relations. You've missed all my jokes, absolutely. So all you can do now is listen to the serious parts of the talk. All the jokes are over. I came at the right time. But on September 11, 2001 in the US, a different challenge arose to the notion of a global imagination. If, as the historian Eric Hobsbawm has suggested, the 20th century really began with the assassination in Sarajevo that sparked the First World War, it's fair to suggest that in the impact it has already had on the shape of our era, the 21st century began with the demolition of the World Trade Center just 11 years ago. I suspect that on 9/11, the 21st century was born. What do I mean by that? The destruction of the World Trade Center seemed to have struck a blow not only at the institutions of American and global capitalism, but at the self-confidence that undergirded them. The self-confidence of a social and political system that, without needing to think about it too much, believed it had found the answer to life's challenges and could conquer them all. And of course, the outrage that September 11 brought, the outrage of that September 11 brought the stark consciousness of physical vulnerability to the most powerful country in the world. A country that, despite fighting a dozen major wars in its history, had not seen a direct attack on a major city in living memory. The US at that time enjoyed a level of comparative military power unprecedented in human history. Even the Roman Empire at its peak did not come close to outstripping the military capacities of the rest of the world to the extent that the United States did in 2001. But that is not all. When the former French Foreign Minister, Hubert Védrine, called the US a hyperpuissance, a hyperpower, he was alluding not only to American military dominance, but also to the US as the home of Boeing and Intel, of Microsoft and MTV, of Ford and the iPod, of Hollywood and Disneyland, of McDonald's and Starbucks, Coca-Cola and Levi's jeans, in short of most of the major brands and products that dominate daily life around our globe. This was the country in which a scholar could complacently propound the end of history. On 9/11, history, like Mark Twain, proclaimed that reports of its demise were exaggerated. In today's ever smaller world, geography too offered no protection. If only by bringing to Americans the end of their insulation from the passions that had bedeviled the rest of the globe, September 11 changed the world forever. The horrifying events of that one day are also emblematic of our new century. And one could say something very similar about 26/11 in Mumbai. See, the defining features of today's world are the relentless forces of globalization, the ease of communications and travel, the shrinking of boundaries, the flow of people of all nationalities and cultures around the world, the swift pulsing of financial transactions with the press of a button. The aeroplane, the mobile phone, the computer are the tools of our time. These very forces, which in a more benign moment might have been seen as helping drive the world towards progress and prosperity, were the very forces used by the terrorists on September 11 in their macabre dance of death and destruction. The terrorists crossed frontiers easily, coordinated their efforts with technological precision, hijacked jets and crashed them into their targets as their doomed victims made last-minute calls on their mobile phones to their loved ones. So this was the 21st century crime, and it has defined the dangers and potential of our time as nothing else can. And 9/11 also made clear the cliché about our global village, for it showed that a fire that starts in a remote thatched hut or a dusty cave, in this case, in one corner of our global village, can melt the steel girders that hold up the tallest skyscrapers at the opposite end of our global village. And this terrorist attack, like its horrible descendants in London and Madrid and Bali and then in Mumbai, were assaults not just on one country, but in their callous indifference to the lives of innocents, an assault on the very bonds of humanity that tie us all together. Again, in 26/11, what do we see? They used hotels. They used the hotels frequented by the transnational business elite. They used GPS systems. They used mobile telephone calls, giving them instructions. Again, the same phenomenon, using the technological tools of the 21st century to assault these very bonds that pull us together in the globalized world. So to respond to this assault on globalization, as it were, using the tools of globalization, we must stay united. Terrorism does not originate in one country. Its practitioners are not based in any one country. Its victims are not found in any one country. And the response to it must also involve all countries. And yet that raises the question of whether we risk homogenizing our collective imagination in responding to this global threat. In one sense, the terrorists of 9/11 were attacking the globalization of the human imagination, the godless, materialist, promiscuous culture of the dominant West, embodied in a globalization from which the people who applauded them felt excluded. Terrorism emerges from a blind hatred of the other, and that in turn is the product of three factors: fear, rage, and incomprehension. Fear of what the other might do to you, rage at what you believe the other has already done to you, and incomprehension about who or what the other really is. These three elements fuse together in igniting the deadly combustion that kills and destroys people whose only sin is that they feel none of these things themselves. If terrorism is to be tackled and ended, we will have to deal with each of these three factors by attacking the ignorance that sustains them. We will have to know each other better, learn to see ourselves as others see us, learn to recognize hatred and deal with its consequences and its causes, learn to dispel fear, and above all, just learn about each other. This is no small challenge. With the best will in the world, it is easy to misunderstand each other. We need to ask what factors, what assumptions lead surprisingly large numbers of young people to follow the desperate course set for them by fanatics and ideologues. 5 decades ago, in 1962, the now all but forgotten UN Secretary General U Thant warned that an explosion of violence could occur as a result of the sense of injustice felt by those living in poverty and despair in a world of plenty. Some 2,600 people died in the World Trade Center on 11 September 2001, but some 26,000 people also died on that same day around the world from starvation, unclean drinking water, and preventable disease. We cannot afford to exclude them from our global imagination. But that is, of course, not all. If a state cannot even offer its people hope for a better life for its children, by providing access to basic education, for instance, then how can we expect those people or those children to resist the blandishments of terror? It should come as no surprise that the Taliban in Afghanistan recruited its foot soldiers from the religious schools or madrasas that were the only source of nurture and education, quote unquote, for the many children who had no other source of knowledge available to them, who learned not science or mathematics or computer programming at these schools, but rather only the creed of the Quran and the Kalashnikov. The Quran crudely interpreted, the Kalashnikov crudely made. In a world where too many people have little or no hope of reaping the benefits of our globalizing world, who can be surprised that they view it as something to be derided and even to be attacked? So we must work together to ensure that all people have access to, at a minimum, the opportunity to live beyond starvation, to receive an education, and to have realistic hopes for a better future. Of course, eliminating dire poverty will not in itself solve the problems we've talked about in this age of terror. The pilots of 9/11 were not poor. Indeed, their pilots' licenses could have guaranteed them comfortable middle-class lives. Those who support, applaud, and orchestrate terrorism are not driven solely by a sense of economic injustice. A sense of oppression, of exclusion, of marginalization can also give rise to extremism. But our globalized world also offers hope for a solution to this sense of disenfranchisement and despair. That world that I described earlier, the one in which it's easier than ever before to see or hear strangers at our breakfast tables, this can also become a world in which it's easier than ever before to see strangers as essentially no different from ourselves. In today's world, finding hope in shared experience, in our common humanity, is not mere piety. Two ways of doing this readily come to mind. First, and I don't say this merely because I've become a minister for education, we need to provide access to education and information to all people. And second, we need to ensure that the knowledge that is conveyed and the information that is conveyed is truly global, diverse, pluralistic, and tolerant. And the substance is every bit as important as the means. The mass media that now rings our globalized world still principally reflects the interests of its producers. What passes for international culture is usually the culture of the economically developed world. Ask yourselves, who makes the cut to enter the global imagination in our brave new world? Yes, there is an occasional third world voice, but it speaks a first world language. As far back as the Congo Civil War of 1962, 5 decades ago, the journalist Edward Baer saw a television newsman in a camp of violated Belgian nuns going around with his TV camera and microphone calling out, "Anybody here been raped and speak English?" In other words, it was not enough to have suffered. One must have suffered and be able to express one's suffering in the language acceptable to the journalist. It is still the unfortunate truth that those speaking for their cultures in the globalized media are often not the most authentic representatives of them. Some believe that the bias inherent in the mass media will be overcome by the internet. And there's no doubt that the internet can be a democratizing tool. In some parts of the world, the Western developed world essentially, it has already become one, since large amounts of information are now accessible to almost anyone. But that is not yet true in the developing world. The stark reality of the internet today is that there is a digital divide. You can tell the rich from the poor by their internet connections. The information revolution today, rather unlike the French Revolution, is a revolution with a lot of liberty, some fraternity, and no equality. So the poverty line is not the only line we have to think about. There's also the high-speed digital line, the fiber optic line, all the lines that exclude those who are literally not plugged into the possibilities of our brave new world, but that empower those who are. The key to the internet divide is the computer keyboard. Those who do not have one risk marginalization. Their imaginations cannot cross borders. Advances are being made. The growing strength of mobile phone usage in South Asia, and indeed even in sub-Saharan Africa, is one example. India sells today over 8 million cell phones a month. In 3 successive months in 2010, it actually set a new world record by selling 20 million phones each of those months. Now, if the internet can come easily onto mobile phones, then we will see the democratizing power of the internet in our country. But to actually go to an internet cafe and log in is beyond the means still of 85% of our population. Those of you who travel have seen the proliferation of internet cafes in our country, but there's a long way to go before we can truly democratize information access worldwide and help people everywhere improve their lives. As a writer and as a reader, I'm conscious of how much reading and learning do to broaden minds. And I'm convinced that ignorance and prejudice remain the handmaidens of violence. This is as true of terrorism as it is of modern civil conflicts, that men of war prey on the ignorance, indeed, and ignorance and prejudice to instill fears and arouse hatreds. That was the case in Bosnia and in Rwanda, where murderous, even genocidal ideologies took root in the absence of truthful information and honest education. If only half the effort had gone into teaching those peoples what united them and not what divided them, unspeakable crimes could have been prevented. And I would argue that looking to what unites us is no threat to our sense of what makes us special, our distinctive individual identities. Yet many do feel threatened. The biggest challenge to coexistence within many societies and between societies comes from the assault that both the forces of convergence and disruption, which I've described to you, make on our identity. In many ways, the fundamental conflict of our times is the clash between, no, not civilizations, but doctrines, religious and ethnic fundamentalism on the one hand, and secular consumerist capitalism on the other. The author Benjamin Barber, for instance, has written of the twin prospects facing humanity as jihad versus mech world. And I quote him here: jihad in the name of 100 narrowly conceived faiths against every kind of interdependence, against technology, against pop culture, against integrated markets, against modernity itself, versus a mech world of globalization run rampant, a world of fast music, fast computers and fast food, with MTV, Macintosh and McDonald's pressing nations into one commercially homogeneous theme park, unquote. Now, this is an excessively simplistic argument. As I've argued earlier, the terrorists use technology. Indeed, we know that terrorists have no problem with pop culture as long as it's not extended to their societies. They enjoy it themselves. The terrorists of 9/11 had their last meal at a McDonald's. We've heard about terrorists attacking India after watching Bollywood movies. So one could argue that the syllogism is too simplistic. And the commercially homogeneous theme park is also simplistic. But the argument is interesting because he's suggesting that both jihad and mech world end up by obliterating our most precious possession, which is, after all, our identity. But there is a counter-argument to that too, which is that every one of us possesses many identities. Amartya Sen, our great thinker, Nobel Prize winner, has argued that ascribing singular identities to people, for example, let's say calling someone a Muslim while overlooking other aspects of his individual makeup, leads to the miniaturization of human beings and what he calls the belittling of human identity. He's argued passionately against reducing individuals to a choiceless singularity. Few people, after all, have a choice about the religion they're born into, when all of us have so much more complexity to our identities. Sometimes religion obliges us to deny the truth about our own complexity by obliterating the multiplicity inherent in our identities. Islamic fundamentalism in particular has done so in recent years because it embodies a passion for pure belonging, a yearning intensified by the threatening tidal wave of globalization as well as by the nature of Middle Eastern politics. And yet we do need to understand why so many today, in privileging one amongst the many identities they could lay claim to, have fallen back on religion. Why are so many political grievances, real or imagined, articulated in religious terms? The answer surely lies in the primordial nature of religious identity, when other avenues of identity mobilization are either restricted in autocratic states or difficult in societies where political patterns are entrenched and admit few interlopers, then ordinary people tend to fall back upon the one identity that seems basic to them. Secular intellectuals like Amartya Sen, or for that matter myself, may give equal weight to the identity of being a cricket fanatic, or in his case an Oxbridge Don, or a politician in my case, may give equal weight to that as being born into a Hindu family. But people like us, I still fear, are a minority in today's world, and it would be unwise indeed for us to ignore the clarion call of religious fanaticism to so many desperate young women, men and women around the world. Of course, there can be something precious and valuable about religion, about having a faith that allows a human being to see himself at one with others, stretching their hands out towards God around the world. But can we separate religion from identity? Can we dream of a world in which religion has an honored place, but where the need for spirituality will no longer be associated with the need to belong? If identity can relate principally to citizenship rather than faith, to a land rather than a doctrine, and that identity is one that can live in harmony with other identities, then we might resist both jihad and make world. If we all come to understand and accept that every one of us has many identities, then perhaps we can each assert each of them without attacking others. As a writer, I'm attracted to what one might call the cultural construct of identity, of which religion is only a part, and to many not even the most important part. We must admit that many have seen globalization as a threat to the differentiated cultures of the non-Western parts of the world. The great fear is that indigenous cultures will be swept aside in a great tidal wave of MTV, McDonald's, and Mickey Mouse. As an Indian author, coming from a country that has globalized more rapidly than most, and whose culture has therefore been subject to Western influences of a highly visible kind, I'm particularly conscious of this. And yet I would argue that my country's recent experience with the global reach of Western consumer products demonstrates that we can drink Coca-Cola without becoming Coca-Colanized. Despite the fears of many, Baywatch and burgers have not supplanted Bharatnatyam dances and Bhel Puri snacks in India. India's own popular culture is also part of globalization. The products of Bollywood are exported to expatriate Indian communities abroad, but also to foreigners, to Arabs and Africans in particular. A Senegalese friend has told me of his illiterate mother, who takes a bus to Dakar every month from her village just to see a Bollywood movie. She doesn't understand the Hindi dialogue. She's illiterate, so she can't read the French subtitles. Now, these movies are made to be understood despite such handicaps. And she has a great time watching the song and the dance and the action, and she goes away looking at India with stars in her eyes as a result. An Indian diplomat friend in Damascus a few years ago told me that the only publicly displayed portraits in Damascus that were as big as those of then President Hafiz al-Assad were those of the Bollywood superstar Amitabh Bachchan. My son, traveling in Western China, after having gone through parts of China where he was looked at as a total stranger, especially in the company of his Han Chinese girlfriend, arrived in Western China, in Turkestan, and was promptly greeted in the bazaars with cries of Shah Rukh Khan. So this kind of spreading of culture is a global phenomenon as well. Indian music, Indian fashion, Indian movie stars are also demonstrating new forms of convergence in the West today. With that convergence comes an interesting form of disruption. In England today, for example, the spread of Indian restaurants means that Indian curry houses, as they call them, employ more people than the shipbuilding, coal mining, and iron and steel industries combined. So the empire can strike back. Now, where does this leave the human imagination? In my first novel, the Great Indian Novel, as I called it, I reinvented our 2,000-year-old epic, the Mahabharata, as a satirical retelling of the story, the political story of 20th century India from the British days to the present. My motivation was a conscious one. Most developing countries are formerly colonized countries, and one of the realities of colonialism is that it appropriated the cultural definition of its subject peoples. Writing about India in English, I cannot but be aware of those who've done the same before me, others with a greater claim to the language, but a lesser claim to the land. But their stories are not my stories, their heroes are not mine, and my fiction sought to reclaim my country's heritage for itself, to tell in an Indian voice a story of India. Let me stress, a story of India, for there are always other stories and other Indians to tell them. How important is such a reassertion of identity in the face of the enormous challenges confronting a country like India? Can literature, for example, matter in a land of poverty, suffering, and underdevelopment? I believe it does. Indeed, that cultural reassertion is as vital as economic development. My novel, in fact, begins with the proposition that India is not, as people keep calling it, an underdeveloped country, but rather, in the context of its history and cultural heritage, a highly developed one in an advanced state of decay. Now, such sentiments are the privilege of the satirist, but as a novelist, I believe with Molière that you have to entertain in order to edify. But edify to what end? What is the responsibility of the journalist, the creative artist, the writer in a developing country in our globalizing world? Is there a responsibility? In my own writing, I've pointed to one possible responsibility: to contribute towards and to help articulate and give expression to the cultural identity, shifting, variegated, and multiple in the Indian case, of a post-colonial society caught up in the throes of globalization. The vast majority of developing countries have emerged recently from the incubus of colonialism. Both colonialism and globalization have in many ways fractured and distorted their cultural self-perceptions. Development will not occur without a reassertion of identity, that this is who we are, that this is what we are proud of, that this is what we want to be. Writers and creative artists must find new ways and revive old ones of expressing their evolving culture, just as society strives in the midst of globalization to find new ways of being and becoming. And that is what this Biennale is ultimately all about. Globalization, its advocates say, is about growth and development. But it cannot just be a set of figures on GNP tables, a subject for economists and businessmen, rather than a matter of people. We're all familiar with the notion that man does not live by bread alone. After all, why does man need bread? To survive. But why bother to survive if it is only to eat more bread? To live is more than just to sustain life. It is to enrich and be enriched by life. Our poorest men and women in our country and countries across the world feel the throb of imagination on their pulse, for they tell stories to their children under the starlit skies, stories of their land and its heroes, stories of the earth and its mysteries, stories that have gone into making them who they are. And of course, since my second novel was about Bollywood, I should say this, they see and hear stories too, in the flickering lights of the thousands of cinemas in our land, where myth and escapist fantasy intertwine, and moral righteousness almost invariably triumphs with the closing credits. And that is as it should be. For if people are to develop, it is unthinkable that they would develop without literature, without song, and art, and dance, and music, and myth, without stories about themselves, and in turn without expressing their views on their present lot and their future hopes. Development implies dynamism. Dynamism requires freedom, the freedom to create. Creativity requires, quite simply, imagination. But in speaking of a cultural reassertion of imagination, I do not want to defend a closed construct. I believe Indians will not become any less Indian if, in Mahatma Gandhi's metaphor, we open the doors and windows of our country and let foreign winds blow through our house. For me, the winds of globalization must blow both ways. The Charter of UNESCO memorably tells us, and I quote, that as war begins in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the foundations of peace must be constructed. In these less sexist days today, we would speak of humankind rather than of men, but the sentiment is true, not just of war and peace, but of the entire fabric of human life and society, which must be constructed in the mind. As the acolytes of Osama bin Laden or the young foot soldiers of the Taliban have taught us, the globe will always have more than a single mind. But this can be a virtue if these minds can all be inoculated against violence. And that is why the human imagination is so essential in our shrinking globe. As someone once observed about water pollution, we all live downstream. We are all interconnected. But without extending our imagination, we cannot understand how people of other races, religions, or languages share the same dreams, the same hopes. Without educating and broadening our minds, we cannot understand the myriad manifestations of the human condition, nor fully appreciate the universality of human aims and aspirations. This is why, as a writer, I would argue that the specificities of literature are the best antidote to the fear-dominated globalization of the imagination. Not that literature implies a retreat from the globe. Rather, it is the mind shaped by literature that understands the world and responds to its needs. Literature teaches us to empathize, to look beyond the obvious and beneath the surface, to bear in mind the smaller picture of the ordinary human beings who are ultimately the objects of all public policy. And above all, to remember there is always more than one side to a story and more than one answer to a question. Those are fairly useful prescriptions for public policy makers in this era of globalization. But it's also an ancient insight. I've always believed that in much of the world there exist societies whose richness lies in their soul and not in their soil, whose past may offer more wealth than their present, whose imagination is more valuable than their technology. Recognizing that this might be the case, and affirming that tolerance and imagination are as central to humanity's sense of its own worth as the ability to eat and drink and sleep under a roof, is a vital part of the challenge before the world today. The only way to ensure that this challenge is met is to preserve cultural and imaginative freedom in all societies, to guarantee that individual voices find expression, that all ideas and forms of art are enabled to flourish and contend for their place in the sun. We have heard in the past that the world must be made safe for democracy. That goal has increasingly been realized. It is now time for all of us to work to make the world safe for diversity. I'm going to end with an old Indian story about truth, a story from our Puranas. It seems that in ancient times, a brash young warrior sought the hand of a beautiful princess. The king, her father, thought the warrior was a bit too cocksure and callow, so he told him he could only marry the princess once he had found truth. So the young warrior set out on a quest for truth. He went to temples and to monasteries, to mountain tops where sages meditated, to forests where ascetics scourged themselves, but nowhere could he find truth. Despairing one day and seeking refuge from a thunderstorm, he found himself in a dank and musty cave. There in the darkness he spied an old hag, with warts on her face and matted hair, her skin hanging in folds from her bony limbs, her teeth broken, her breath malodorous. But she greeted him. She seemed to know what he was looking for. They talked all night, and with each word she spoke, the warrior realized he had come to the end of his quest. She was truth. In the morning, when the storm broke, the warrior prepared to return to claim his bride. Now that I have found truth, he said, what shall I tell them at the palace about you? The wizened old crone smiled. Tell them, she said, tell them that I am young and beautiful. So truth is not always true, but that does not mean that truth does not exist. Terrorists fail to see their victims as human beings entitled to their own imaginations. They see only objects, dispensable pawns in their drive for destruction. Our only effective answer to them must be to defiantly assert our own humanity, to say that each one of us, whoever we are and wherever we are, has the right to live, to love, to hope, to dream, and to aspire to a world in which everyone has that right. A world in which the scourge of terrorism is fought, but so also are the scourges of poverty, of famine, of illiteracy, of ill health, of injustice, of human insecurity. A world, in other words, in which terror will have no chance to flourish. That could be the world of the 21st century that has just been born, and it could be the most hopeful legacy of the horror that has given it birth. I believe the Kochi-Muziris Biennale is a great initiative to help us realize such a world in which the creative imagination becomes the most significant influence in globalization through the spread of these universal human values and democracy. Let me congratulate the organizers for their vision and their passion to celebrate the human imagination here. Let this event become a beacon for the creative spirit that is sometimes lost amongst the fears and insecurities of our times. Thank you for giving me a patient hearing. Jai Hind.